One day, over a picnic lunch by an algae-covered pond in Normandy, Imre got a dreamy look in his eyes and said, "A raw egg he would also appreciate." It took me a minute to realize he was talking about the hedgehog. My own excursion into the world of naturalist writing actually began as a question of feminist methodology. A friend of mine had written a book about archiving. In it, she considered various ways in which women store certain information in their bodies. I was trying to come up with a word for this messy, interesting process, which I wanted to call gynarchivism. So first I Googled gynarchy, which literally means government by women, but is most frequently used to refer to insect societies dominated by females. I was quickly directed to Social Life Among the Insects, an obscure text published in 1922 by William Morton Wheeler. The extract that popped up was weirdly captivating. In it, Wheeler notes that certain species have succeeded in, quote, reducing the male to a mere episode in the life of the female. During the singular act of mating in these insects, a prodigious one-night stand, sperm is deposited in the female's spermatheca, a small muscular sac supplying glandular secretions that can preserve the sperm alive indefinitely. According to a generally accepted theory, Wheeler wrote, the female can voluntarily contract the wall of her spermatheca and thus permit sperm to leave it and fertilize the eggs as they are passing its orifice on their way to being laid, or she can keep the orifice closed and thus lay unfertilized eggs. That is, she can perform birth control just by clenching her spermatheca when she's ovulating. We are justified, Wheeler continues, in regarding the female parasitoid wasp, bee, or ant, after she has appropriated and stored in her spermatheca all the essential elements of the male, as a potential hermaphrodite. At this point, Wheeler's account begins to sound something like an Alfred Hitchcock movie. In the solitary wasps, the male is a non-entity, although in a few species he may hang around and try to guard the nest. But in the bees, ants, and social wasps, he has not even the status of a loafing policeman, and all the activities of the community are carried on by the females, and mostly by widows, debutantes, and spinsters. He concludes the passage, the facts certainly compel even those who, like myself, are neither feminists nor vegetarians, to confess that the whole trend of evolution in the most interesting of social insects is towards an ever-increasing matriarchy, or gynarchy, and vegetarianism. Needless to say, I immediately ordered the book on interlibrary loan. I should pause here to tell you that I live with an amateur naturalist. This was not an obvious turn of events in my life. We met when I was in my 50s, he in his 60s, and when he first invited me to visit his little cottage in the countryside of Normandy, I warned him that I was something of a city slicker. I'd been residing happily in New York for over a quarter of a century and didn't have much experience with, nor appetite for, country living. Imre, on the other hand, was born in Paris and lived there for most of his life, with occasional sojourns in other parts of the world. But he abandoned urbanity in his 40s and decamped to what I sometimes call his hobbit house in a little hamlet called Pourry. When I first went there, I was charmed. In the daylight hours, the birds sing and the breeze whistles through the trees, but at night it's utterly silent. I can sometimes sleep there for 11 hours at a stretch. There's a forest nearby where Imre forages for baby toads and salamander larvae, which he tends to in a couple of large glass boxes in the house, furnishing them with moss, muck, beetles, and slugs. Ever since we decided to cohabitate, our time has mostly been spent at the New York apartment. But whenever my teaching schedule allows it, we hightail it to the house in Normandy. During our last day there, we tiptoed out of the house one evening to watch a hedgehog nibbling at the dinner scraps we'd left by the front door. I'd never seen a hedgehog up close. It was adorable. Imre gently poured some milk into a saucer and placed it nearby. In the morning, the milk was gone. Imre was happy, like a 10-year-old kid. He was also pleased about my newfound interest in entomology. One day he showed me two of his favorite childhood books, Pluck chez les fourmis and Pluck chez les abeilles. In them, Pluck, a miniature boy in striped leggings and a matching stocking cap, has some madcap adventures amongst the ants and bees. But back to Wheeler. When I received my library copy of Social Life Among the Insects, there were more surprises. On the very first page, Wheeler salutes Prince Kropotkin. That won't come as such a surprise to you if you know that Kropotkin was also a naturalist, but in citing his observations regarding mutual aid in nature as a necessary corrective, or at least complement, to Darwinian theory, Wheeler goes on to argue for the post-war impulse toward ever greater solidarity, of general disarmament, of a drawing together not only of men to men, but of nations to nations throughout the world, of a recasting and refinement of all our economic, political, social, educational, and religious activities for the purposes of greater mutual helpfulness. As for that disavowal of his own feminism, I wondered about his sincerity. In snooping around some more on the internet, I discovered that he appeared to return habitually in his writings, which were copious, to what he called the problem of the male. Among many species, including our own, Wheeler claimed that his own sex might be properly called the antisocial sex. The disavowal of vegetarianism, however, appeared to be true, and yet, again, it followed the logic of many insects. Regarding the life of the female, things really came to a head in the passage of Social Life in which Wheeler presented the parable of the Sphex wasps, as he put it, in the form of a tragic drama in 3 acts, with the following brief synopsis. Act 1. A sandy country with sparse vegetation inhabited by caterpillars and other insects. Time, a hot, sunny day in early August. Scene 1. Miss Sphex, arrayed in all the charm of maidenhood, being courted by Mr. Sphex. Wedding among the flowers. Scene 2. Mrs. Sphex, deserted by her scatterbrained spouse, settles down and excavates a kind of cyclone cellar. She closes its door and leaves the stage. Act 2. Scene 1. Same as in Act 1. Mrs. Sphex, hunting in the vegetation, finds a caterpillar, struggles with it, stings it, and gnaws its neck till it lies motionless. Scene 2. She drags it into the cellar and, placing her offspring on it behind the scenes, returns and at once leaves the stage after locking the door, amid a storm of applause. Act 3. Scene 1. Interior of Mrs. Sphex's cellar. Baby Sphex slowly devouring caterpillar till only its skin remains. Scene 2. Baby Sphex, now a large, buxom lass, weaves an elaborate nightgown for herself and goes to bed as the curtain falls. Despite its electrifying plot and mise-en-scène, Wheeler himself declares this drama defective in Aristotelian terms because the climax comes too soon, with the heroine abandoning the stage to her drowsy offspring in the 3rd act. So, he proposes a revision in which the 3rd act replaces the 1st, with the 1st and 2nd acts becoming the 2nd and 3rd. Thus, the daughter becomes the central figure, and we follow her gradual transformation from infancy through a troubled marriage and desertion to her heroic excavation of the cellar, and concluding with, quote, the thrilling chase, stinging, and entombment of the hereditary victim in the 3rd act. Medea, anyone? Wheeler admits to having committed the unpardonable sin of anthropomorphizing the wasp, but asks for a little more patience from his reader as he proceeds to vespize the human being. Suppose that the human mother were in the habit of carefully tying her newborn baby to the armpit of a paralyzed elephant, which she had locked in a huge cellar. Okay. The baby, we must of course suppose that it is a girl baby, is armless, legless, and blind, but has been born with powerful jaws and teeth and an insatiable appetite. Under the circumstances, she would have to eat the elephant or die. Supposing now that she fed on the elephant day after day, between naps, till only its tough hide and hard skeleton were left, and that she then took an unusually long nap and woke as a magnificent, winged, strong-limbed Amazon, with a marvelously keen sense of smell and superb eyes, clad in burnished armor, and with a poisoned lance in her hand. With such attractions and equipment, we could hardly expect her to stay long in a cellar. She would at once break through the soil into the daylight. Now, suppose she happened to emerge, with a great and natural appetite, in a zoological garden. Should we be astonished to see her make her way straight for the elephant house? Why, she would recognize the faintest odor of elephant borne to her on the breeze. She would herself be, in a sense, merely a metabolized elephant. Of course, we should be startled to see her leap on the elephant's back, plunge her lance into its armpit, drag it several miles over the ground, hide it in a cellar, and tie her offspring to its hide. All of this is ostensibly laid out in order to illustrate an argument regarding larval memory, though it seems to me to have larger implications.
In 1998, I was in my 40s. My daughter Lucy was 6, and exhausted by the Parisian life, the little family decided to move in Normandy. A few months after, I bought myself a shovel and started digging a hole. Not to make it my grave, it wasn't time yet, but I had an idea in mind. It was the beginning of February. People call it winter, but they don't know more than the calendar about seasons. The spring is like the war. It has to be prepared, and the truth is that spring starts in the middle of winter, invisible to the eye of man. Still, all you have to do is to dig a little to discover the bulbs of the flowers to come, or to turn the stones and watch the transparent larvae and caterpillars that will become bugs and butterflies. In the bodies of the trees that seem dead, the sap is already flowing to the top branches that will soon turn green. In the darkness of the soil, the wheat, barley and oat seeds are beginning to germinate. In the frozen still waters, amphibians' life is incubating. The animals in the forest are also preparing their comeback. The winter is probably the most sensual season because it's the one that prepares to pleasure. That year, when spring finally came, I was still digging a pond. I don't know where my passion for ponds and their occupants came from. What I know is that I have 2 webbed toes on each foot. Also maybe that weird confidence my mother told me one day that I had been conceived in the Red Sea. Or maybe, just as Ferenczi reminds us in his wonderful Thalassa essay, that we all come from water, as a species and as individuals. Of course, my father played his role also, taking me every spring during my childhood and much later after, with a little fish net to capture all sorts of amphibians. 3 months after my first shoveling, my 2 sons came to give me a hand, and soon a large hole filled with water was laying where there had only been grass and flintstones. Then there was a pond. I just had to add life to it. So I went with my kids and a fish net, collecting amphibians from all the ponds around. I also added some water plants, and soon you would have thought it was a regular natural pond. Except it was mine. The frogs seemed happy and started to mate. Of course, I hadn't forgotten the newts, salamanders, and the most important to me, the toads. And there were weird encounters of the third kind. Among all the amphibians, my favorite one is definitely the toad. In fairy tales, witches transform princes into toads. To me, it's more a promotion than a curse. Still, most people fear that beast or even get repulsed by it, as with Quasimodo or Frankenstein. Just like them, the toad is a night wanderer, a solitary guy. Except when a passionate lover. To me, it's one of the most beautiful creatures on earth, especially if you look at his eyes. If you magnified the eye of a toad, he would be surpassing in splendor Jupiter or Mars as a planet. George Orwell agreed with me, saying, "A toad has about the most beautiful eye of any living creature." Anyway, by the end of that spring of '98, I felt sort of proud of myself. I had created, if not the universe, at least a tiny spot of it. Today, I live practically full-time in New York, an ocean away from my pond, and we both have aged. As for me, it's just a matter of time carving. Concerning the pond, it's partly my fault. When I had dug it at the edge of the forest to provide some shade, I had forgotten then, just like in Macbeth, the trees march on, and hence, so does the forest. Today the pond lays deep in the undergrowth, imprisoned by trunks invisible to the eye and with hardly any access to the daylight. So here in New York, to keep in touch with nature, I decided to read various naturalist to scientific writers, but first to reread again Ferenczi Thalassa. A few lines drew my attention. It is only the imaginative and spirited writings of Bolshe, so underrated even now as an original thinker. That made me curious, and I discovered that this German naturalist from the end of the 19th century had written an impressive quantity of books. Only 3 were available in English. I ordered one because of the title. From the very first lines, I was hypnotized. Had the guy visited the outer space, the deep bottoms of the ocean? Yes, through his imagination. I won't try here to describe the content of the book. It's the most fantastic voyage into our universe, except it's no fantastic tale. It's just a poetic, visionary, and scientific exploration of the world we live in and its origins. Truly one of the most extraordinary books I've ever read. But by the way, beyond Ferenczi, to whom did I owe the pleasure of this discovery? Who had thought it was worth being translated and then did the job? A woman. I got curious again, and the first thing I found online was a speech she had addressed to the Socialist Convention of Chicago in 1910 at the age of 33. Yes, Maywood Simons was socialist, and so was her husband, L.G. Simons. It was a time when socialism and naturalism went hand in hand. I don't think that many people know about this detail. She is the one who created the International Women's Day. Anyway, this is what I read. As we gather in this auditorium this morning, I bring you the greetings of the army of unemployed men who are looking up and down the streets of our city for work which may not be found, sleeping in the station houses at night, eating semi-occasionally, and begging for work which is refused to them. They walk the streets, sometimes day and night, and their cry is work, work, work. To you, I bring their greetings. To you also I bring the greetings of the men and women shrunken and misshapen in body, soul and mind, the men and women of our factories who are trickling their lifeblood out of their fingertips to turn into gold in the coffers of their masters. I bring you the greeting from an army, the army of men and women and children, very little children sometimes, who are torturing out their days and nights in the sweatshops. I bring you their greeting. From the widows with breaking backs and sunken cheeks, doing the work of men, I bring you their heartiest greeting also. And I also bring you greeting from the dead, from beyond the grave. I bring you greeting from those who have been slaughtered and hidden in nameless graves. Across the gulf of death into which their corpses have been thrown, they reach out to you hands of greetings. In muffled voices, they call and bid you, you men and women of the future. There are hands reaching out to you in this hall this morning. They are hard, bony hands, the hard, old, bony hands of the man who has been cast onto the scrap heap because he cannot produce dividends. Then there are young hands, the hands of young men in the height of their enthusiasm, begging you to save them from slavery. Then there are the hands of women, calloused hands with fingers twisted from unwanted toil of men. Mothers' hands are stretched out to you. You all know what a mother's hand is like. They are stretched out to you now in appeal. Do your duty, and they will reach forth to you from the land of the living and from beyond the grave in blessing. Baby hands, little hands in which the bones have not yet hardened, but which know the meaning of toil. Yes, and which will know to the full the bitterness meaning of the years to come, the short years which will be theirs in the sweatshop. You men and women assembled here, what will be your answer to the pleading of the hands? You have come to Chicago when the great industrial system which has been built up here is confessing the inability of capitalism to control and rule because it cannot feed and clothe the worker. You have come at a time when it's proven that capitalism has failed, at a time when it's proven that only in socialism, organized socialism, is there any hope for the salvation of the worker. The most inspiring thing to me about the whole combat for the betterment of humankind is that the women are standing shoulder to shoulder with the men in this struggle. When the women make up their minds to stand by the men in this fight, the fight is won. Working men of the world, unite. You have only your chance to lose. This was said by Karl Marx. If that grand old German were alive today and could stand before you, he would say to the women now, women of the world, unite. You have double chance to lose, and you have the world to gain. When I finished reading this, my vision was blurred with emotion. I immediately went and shared it with Barbara, who was working under her tree and was just as moved. Half an hour later, she had booked a trip for us in the city of Baraboo, Wisconsin, where Maywood was born, including a detour through Madison for consulting the archives at the university, articles, letters, diaries, almost a personal encounter. Baraboo is another story, another revelation linked to another passion of mine, the circus. It was there that the Ringling Brothers had started their career, and the circus is still alive, and the elephants and tigers are still on the go. When back in New York, Barbara felt I was missing nature again, so she got me a pet, a baby bearded dragon, a really nice guy, except pretty voracious. We bought it in early September, and this is what he looked like 4 months later. To give it a name seemed pretty obvious. We called it Bolshe. Now I will leave the last word to Thoreau.